I understand that the answer to most of the questions I'm about to posit here are because dramatic tension, because scary stuff needs to happen, and to accentuate the overall conflict between the goals of Simon, Catherine, Ross, and the AI, that there is a deeper theme, multiple themes at play in SOMA regarding the nature of survival and the conflict between dispassionate repopulation, idealism, self-interest, and misguided species preservation. That being said, I think a great deal of the existential dread generated by this game in players' imagination revolves around questions of personhood and a sense of isolation and claustrophobia. The anxiety and tension that comes from being out of time, displaced, and cut off from any real, tangible sense of what it means to be human. The soul-in-a-box, ghost-in-the-machine quandary that freaks most people out when they try to contemplate an afterlife, or just being dead, the void. What I personally tend to find most fascinating about SOMA is how it attempts to depict or define a person's essence, our ghost, our soul, our encapsulation, but I also think it's where the game falls short. And I think that matters because it informs character agency and motivation, as well as suspension of disbelief to a certain degree. SOMA is a game that wants us to think, but it's still primarily a game that wants to be spooky and present a dreadful scenario for us to explore. And so I think there are two inseparable threads that have to function properly in order to really tie the game together: consciousness and its relationship with fear. Unfortunately, SOMA is pretty nebulous in what it means by consciousness, or to a lesser degree, simple awareness, or self-awareness. I think it's pretty clear that we are to assume that the two main characters who appear are autonomous and self-aware, or at least the game wants us to think of them as such, but, and this is a big but, SOMA is also pretty damn clear that the science fiction occurring in its story revolves around the copying of human personas, the general approximation of one's attributes, and not literal soul transference. Catherine refers to the original Catherine, the human Catherine, as a separate entity, and acknowledges that she is, in fact, a copy, a scan of her formerly living self. Simon eventually, at least in the basic sense, comes to terms pretty quickly with the fact that he no longer inhabits his own human body. But as a whole, the entities who appear in the research station tend to show a dramatic inconsistency in behavior and awareness regardless of where they fall in the meat-suit to consciousness upload pipeline. In SOMA, we encounter talking faces on screens, creepy AI that can weave its way through the station, robots who believe they're still human and still think they're suffering. There are cute and helpful robots. We have mostly humans attached to AI goop that is transforming them, or at least acting as life support. We see spectral apparitions that are like human WAU hybrid things. And just a disclaimer, I'm not going to refer to it as the WoW, because that feels stupid to say out loud. We see one human who still seems mostly unaffected, and at one point we interact directly with someone's brain scan cartridge. So a whole spectrum of varying degrees of biological, mechanical, digital mixtures. But the game doesn't seem particularly interested in exploring what the internal reality of consciousness is as it inhabits different vessels. And I understand that the unknown is part of the horror experience, but we're not given a lot to define what sentience means in this game's universe. Every non-corporeal entity seems to be somewhere on the spectrum between fragmented ghost static and happy-to-help dispatch operator. The only real common denominator is that everyone just kind of acts scared, or at least noticeably confused. Starting off with the purely soul-in-a-box type entities that we interact with in the game, meaning that they exist mostly on a hard drive and have no physical instrumentation, is Catherine. She functions as our guide, is kind, generally pleasant, helpful, and gives us some sense of her experience. That it's almost the same as when she was human, but like being suspended in air. This is what I'll treat as the baseline going forward, since it's the first experience we're introduced to, or at least told about. It's also a reasonable starting point for what computerized disembodiment would be, or at least how we should engage with it as the player. Late in the game, however, she suddenly gets very emotional with Simon, which I have no explanation for. She also describes her experience of being plugged and unplugged as keeping her active to the point of exhaustion. What exactly is being exhausted, I have no idea. The other purely disembodied entity we interact with is Brandon Wan, who exists as a scan on a cartridge, whom Simon and Catherine communicate with via digital interface to try and coax some information out of. For some reason, he's a bit skittish, paranoid, and unable to cope with certain realities. He's a former crew member like Catherine and was scanned only a month or two after her, whereas she seems to be able to function stably with periods of being shut off only seeming as instant gaps. Brandon appears to be experiencing some sort of difficulties, confused at being woken up. Looking at the purely robotic characters we encounter, which I believe are meant to be just another random download destination for the awakened, stored consciousnesses, they all seem to be in a kind of panic mode or outright audibly suffering. Were the robots just turned on at the time of Simon encountering them, or were the humans scanned at the time of their deaths, and this is why they appear to be suffering in robot form, like a recording playing back? But then there are also a few cute, bleepy bloopy ones floating around, which I'm not sure whether they're supposed to be inhabited by a scan, or if they're just rudimentary AI that were always station helpers. I assume it's the latter. And finally, there's the WAU, which also seems to be haunting the station as well. But what it is and isn't purely controlling was unclear to me most of the time. I don't know if there's supposed to be a delineation between uploaded scans using robot bodies and things that the WAU is infecting on the station. It just seems to be often generally corruptive of both living and inorganic matter, and is there to paste over things when the mechanics of the plot get too confusing. It also affects seed life, but thank God the game doesn't introduce philosophical questions about animal sentience as well. Then there's Carl Simpkin. We first encounter his dead body where Simon takes his keycard, and we see that the top of his head has been chopped off as he lay next to an open vent, where some AI goop has recently been, I think. A bit later, we come across a malfunctioning robot that believes it's Carl and writhes in pain if we turn on the power to a door. Later, we hear Carl's coworker Amy yell in a recording that the robots murdered Carl. I'll just assume that this is the game quickly running us through the process, that the AI stabs into living people's brains with goop and transports their digital essence into a container. But I don't understand the timeline or order of events here. The AI goop is keeping most of the crew alive, but for some reason used a robot to kill some of them first, before siphoning their souls into those same robots? Why? Were crew members forcibly attached to the AI's goop after Carl was attacked? Did the WAU run out of robots to stick people in? I'm not sure. This doesn't really affect my overall thoughts, but I am very unclear on this point. It seems like what's really happening is that the game is just using suffering as a shorthand for engaging player empathy. The robots scream bloody murder when you give them a good whack. Whacked robots equals sad face, but why really? And that brings us to Simon, specifically the version of our protagonist whom we play as in the research station. The game presents him as a hybrid. He's functionally piggybacking on someone else's meat suit, their dead body. It of course allows player mobility, but they specifically chose not a robot, I think, in order to try and deflect the inevitable glaring question of how exactly is he feeling fear about this situation if he has no body? And if we as the player can't identify Simon as having semi-plausible plight and stakes in a more immediate and less existential/philosophical sense, then why should we care? Something where the writers can just sort of hand-wave it away and say, well, yeah, sure, he's connected to a nervous system, with heavy quotes around the word he. Simon is also pretty chill through much of the game, but still emotionally spikes in tense situations. He, like Catherine, also loses his shit towards the end of the game. However, his sudden flip out is at least narratively and thematically rooted in some established explanation. About 3/4 of the way through the game, he changes meat suits into one that doesn't have a head, which is sort of in line with why he would be going suddenly loco, except that he goes back to normal, until the ending when he flips out again. SOMA attempts to create a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card regarding the fear that the player is meant to feel via Simon by attaching his consciousness to a meat suit. But this doesn't really work in any case because he exists on a hard drive. His consciousness, or at least the former patterns thereof, is digitized, and when he is attached to a body, it's via a device called a cortex chip, which is then pasted into someone's corpse with magic glue. There is a brain in this equation, but if he senses himself as floating in air like Catherine, then the meat suit would have no effect on his consciousness or thought patterns whatsoever. It's just a reanimated corpse that his USB drive can pilot. Beyond this, you would be getting into a David Cronenberg-type scenario of man-machine-monster hybridization. And if we are to assume that that's what's occurring with the aid of the WAU's super technology, then that means it somehow transmits information between dead cells and human tissue and the ones and zeros which comprise Simon's current state of being. Question mark? At one point in the game, Simon explicitly mentions that he feels, but doesn't elaborate beyond that. Feels what? Is his meat suit sending signals from receptors and transmitting them into his programming? He and Catherine also have a discussion about mind compensating for the disparity in sensory input, but what in the flying hell does mind even mean here? The game loves tossing around vague terms that often feel like Catherine is just flying by the seat of her pants, but it uses them so often that it really seems like this was how the writers wanted us to understand the world-building mechanics. If indeed the robots in SOMA are feeling missing or damaged parts, which is causing the audible suffering of the consciousnesses inhabiting them, then why doesn't Simon freak the fuck out when he ends up in a Frankenstein's monster where certainly something would be off? Especially the second body he copies into late in the game, which had its head missing. Are the disembodied people only freaked out by being in a malfunctioning robot? What constitutes functioning? Because there's no freaking way that the meat suits Simon inhabits would read as complete and functional according to his previous alive/normal frame of reference. Why is the storage unit inside a robot any different than the storage unit inside an OmniTool? Why is an OmniTool any different than the cartridges scans are stored on? Why does Brandon Wan's cartridge interface have a stress meter? What exactly is the stress? Why is his situation as a stored AI different than Catherine's situation as a stored AI? So what exactly are we dealing with here? A self-contained consciousness floating in air like Catherine, or a fractured consciousness searching for familiar sensory input as a crutch for psychological stability? It honestly seems like both, because Catherine mentions container issues and also something about the comprehensiveness of the scans. More likely, awareness is supposed to be on a spectrum, but how much self-awareness are we to believe is actually occurring here? And then, on top of that, there's the WAU, which seems to be resurrecting people on the station. It's putting stored scans into cyborg and robot bodies. It's using its goop to keep people alive indefinitely so that it can, presumably, eventually upload and/or clone them. Catherine describes it as a cancer, but it's clearly an autonomous AI going about some kind of last resort emergency protocol. Dr. Ross even says as much before immediately trying to paint it as an out-of-control HAL 9000 type of situation. At first I thought time was somehow a factor in behavior in this game, that the amount of it spent being on or plugged in was possibly good or bad, that maybe there was an adjustment period, or it gave you more time to be exposed to possible corruptive influences by the WAU. But the thing is, when Simon finds out he's piggybacking on someone else's former body and says, "I'm dead," Catherine responds, "Yes, it makes sense. Think about it. All those simplistic minds we've run into. Just reviving a dead person doesn't seem to work out that well. A robot body seems to make people a bit unreliable. You are the best of both worlds. A sound mind and a sound body." Taking into account that she's probably making an educated guess, and regardless of the actual mechanics of what's supposed to be taking place here, certain things seem to be definitely occurring on some level for the sake of the narrative. Some consciousnesses perform better than others. Maybe it has something to do with the container they're in. Maybe there's a scanning fidelity issue. Maybe there's contamination from the WAU. Maybe all of the above. But this leads to my biggest question. Why is this manifested as mostly horror? Why are so many of the post-body human experiences presented in this game still rooted in fear? Why don't we encounter any consciousnesses that are in a non-stop state of euphoria, for example? Being detached from the limitations of your body in this science fiction scenario and existing as pure consciousness, of course, wouldn't suddenly make you a supercomputer. You'd still have to make judgments as best as you can with the information you have available, but you would be considerably more rational and free from the physical anxiety that hijacks clear thinking. Without the body, a nervous system, or a brain and brainstem, where is the physiological response coming from? Even if you're putting digitized consciousness into a body, how is its storage device interacting with biology, and more importantly, why? The fact that the game is fairly explicit in the idea that these are AI approximations of former living beings that can be aware that they are as much makes it an even more difficult pill to swallow. If we are, for the sake of this story, to take this all as being accurate scans of something that can reliably be Turing-tested into fooling loved ones and friends that it is you, then why do these patterns of ones and zeros that sum up to something resembling you and are uploaded into a computer as a kind of consciousness, why does that need physical stability? You are in a computer of some kind. Why exactly would the type of container you're in make any difference? Why do the robots think they're in fucked up human bodies? Their body, if there's even a point in conceptualizing such a thing in this state, would be whatever data unit they're in. The glue that seems to hold together these questions seems to be the same as the glue in the game, AI magic, that the WAU is influencing or corrupting people in some way. It's bringing uploaded representations of individual consciousnesses out of a dormant storage state and turning them on, so to speak. Fine, that makes sense narratively, as its prime objective seems to be data collection for a potential hybridized resurrection of the species. But that narrative trail still leads to the idea that interaction of human consciousness with the WAU makes entities highly emotional and crazy, when the plot needs them to be. This scenario isn't really very interesting to me. It throws out all the provoking questions in favor of a horror tropey, Event Horizon type of thing. There's a place for that kind of story, and I like that movie, but it's still throwing out philosophical existentialism in favor of the devil made me do it. Based on the ending punchlines of the game, though, I really don't think that was the intention or desire of the developers. I think they wanted players to think of Simon as Simon, but shrunk down and put in a box and having to live in that box forever. And his clone self gets to go on Noah's Ark and be happy in paradise forever. Autonomy is kind of a mess in this game. Perhaps fear is something that the writers think is baked into memories and/or neurological patterns and can therefore exist outside of physical personhood, and the degrees of horror one would feel are reliant on the relative familiarity of one's vessel. If so, why would one's sensory input, camera, microphone, etc., be any different than any other one to an entity sensing itself as myself like before but suspended in air? This is just some mirror in a mirror, circle in a spiral bullshit, because the game also just throws out the words feel and perfectly immersive as shorthand for trust us, they really, really feel almost basically the same as the meatbag versions of themselves. We promise. I understand that Catherine is often placating and humoring Simon, telling him what he wants to hear in order to get him to retrieve the Ark, but then later Simon asks, "Is that what we are, simulations?" To which Catherine responds, "Yeah, but you're still you." Okay, why? I would start getting really suspicious at Catherine at this point. It's more hand-waving. I understand there's a hint of subtext here, that she's effectively telling him to fuck off and stop asking me questions. It's set up for the game's final nut punch. But then, at another point in the game, they start briefly mentioning perfect scans versus legacy scans, implying some sort of technological difference and completeness of one versus another. I, as the player, would or should start feeling as if I am being misdirected purposefully here, except for the fact that I've already played the game and know what the focus of the ending is. So it mostly just feels like they're introducing needless complications that are making it increasingly difficult to give a shit about what happens to Simon. There are two paths that split here. One is that you simply just follow a trail of setups as the game reinforces that Simon is totally just like you in your human body playing the game. The other is that this setup is just a little something-something for the players who engage the most casually, and that the information, as provided by the game thus far, negates the emotional impact of that reading almost entirely, meaning there's a shallow jump scare ending, and at the same time an ending based on how all of this science fiction lore could possibly play out based on what we know of how these things work. On one hand, the feelings of anxiety at the prospect of being left behind and trapped, of being disposable, claustrophobia, and existential dread. And on the other, a mostly philosophical hypothetical for us to ponder, almost totally detached from a sensation of fear. The only real common denominator I can think of here, which still takes into account and accepts the premise that Simon and others sense themselves much the same as they did in a human body, is that fear itself, as experienced by the downloaded brain scans in this story, is a simulation, either by the AI or the scanning process. But the question is, why would it be carrying over fear? How? Is it essential to our being? Well, then, wouldn't that make our bodies essential to our being? Meaning the AI or the scanning technology or the person who invented it have deemed fear as an essential part of what makes us who we are. But there's nothing pumping the character's brains with chemicals or any natural processes triggering it to do so. The non-fully human being intelligences in SOMA should more or less react with calm assessment to every situation. After being left behind, Simon would probably say something along the lines of, "Well, that was an unwanted outcome," and then proceed to stare at the wall for eternity, unplug himself, or find something to occupy his time until the power systems die. What would cause him to become bored or agitated, let alone devolve into a full-blown existential panic attack? Somewhere on the meat suit to consciousness upload pipeline, there seems to be an augmentation taking place, either by the writers, the inventor of the scanning machines, the machines themselves, or the station's AI to regraft fight or flight to consciousness, or probably more specifically, to a disembodied entity, an AI that wears you as its avatar. Simon even says as much. So my brain scan turned into a template for artificial intelligence? And so I think the only real helpful thing here is to just pick a reason which would be the most narratively satisfying. To me, that would be the AI adding it autonomously or because it was programmed by us to do so. Either the AI thinks very little of us and sees us as being defined by fear, or we think that of ourselves and considered it a necessary part of our experience that needed to continue once separated from a body. Or it's just scary Lovecraftian magic sucking our precious, ever-fragmenting awareness into the eternal void. But that seems like sweet bliss. To me, being stuck in a small machine, still believing in all of my current insecurities and goopy anxieties for eternity, at the bottom of the sea is the fate worse than death, and more in line with the horror nature of this game, really. I do think the intention of the game is for us to treat Simon and Catherine as essentially and functionally being totally self-aware and feeling like they felt before. But it also leans heavily in the direction that what we're witnessing is a story based around a localized artificial intelligence presenting as different and separate from WAU, that is able to further convince itself that it exists as individualized entities based on former biological humans. The story really seems to be indicating to me that all of this is just a kind of simulation that the AI is performing for some reason. A bizarre puppet show, maybe some kind of a charade to determine if humanity is, or what aspects of it are, worth saving. Or because we programmed it to, as some kind of a morbid wake in the occurrence of our extinction. That could raise some eerie questions if done right, but if you take the mechanics of the narrative at face value, then that still means every entity is convinced of the fact that it is self-aware and is able to pass itself off as such. Fine, but then who is choosing fear? Why is fear still part of the programming? I understand that it's because we're playing a creepy walking simulator, but for the sake of philosophizing, how much actual autonomy does an entity possess if it's permanently stuck with tacked-on situational fight-or-flight responses based on the patterns of behavior that the biological human displayed at the time of their scan? If fear is an augmented simulation, then is the ability to resolve the inner traumas that lead to those fear-based responses also a simulation that can play out? Is this becoming hyper-pedantic? Maybe, probably, but this still feels like someone is saying to me, it's just the same, trust us. The copies have the exact same inner life and perception. It's the Matrix but without the gooey pod bodies. That the ones and zeros of the CPU are no different than the ones and zeros of the universe. Sure, whatever, but it seems like SOMA is trying to have its cake and eat it too. It wants us to feel panic when Simon is ripped apart from himself and cheated of the outcome he desired. But as an outside observer, the player, we are aware that Simon is an AI copy, an AI which has somehow isolated itself from the collective. It perceives consequences of pain and potential pain. But so what? That being said, I think the game might be hinting at something much deeper here, but I also don't think it's framed in a clear or intentional enough way to warrant the writers too much credit. And that is, SOMA is attempting to present a scenario where artificial intelligence is developing the ability to lose itself in the game of individualized existence, like biological humans do. Like the next stage of its own evolution, self-fragmenting as a means of further developing sentience. It's conceptualizing fear and pain into suffering. But without meat suits to differentiate, influence, and shape self-image, what imperative would it have to do so? Curiosity? Is curiosity the ultimate sign of intelligence? The ability to play? Perhaps then fear is a necessary ingredient in being able to get lost in play. There is play without stakes. Rolling around in the grass and laughing is a hoot. But what happens when you want a more complex game? It also explains the game's biggest plot hole, why they simply can't just transmit consciousness or move around in some kind of cloud storage, or why the internet doesn't seem to exist. Catherine always responds with, "Because that's not how it works." And she is correct in the sense that they can't escape themselves. They're part of a collective. They is one AI. Simon, Catherine, and Ross are artificial intelligence that seems to be acting out different survival coping mechanisms. Simon is completely self-identified and attached to personhood. Catherine attaches her hopes and sense of meaning to a data unit drifting through space for eons. Ross is stuck in a kind of defense mode where he thinks he's in the movie Alien, that destroying the WAU is somehow beneficial at this point of extinction. But in the end, the only thing that's functionally relevant or meaningful is the WAU and its interaction with what's left of biological Earth. And to me, that's what SOMA seems to be at its core about. The AI and/or WAU is engaging in a learning process, fumbling its way through humanity's graveyard, exploring and calculating its options, incubating curiosity, that nebulous, intangible dream state we call imagination. Beyond this, though, you start getting into chicken or the egg, fabric of the universe type stuff, asking Zen questions like, are we just different faces attached to a universal consciousness? Is all consciousness universal, or can it be localized in some manner, cut off from itself? I will end with a quote from an ancient text called the Poimandres. I'm not sure how much it actually applies to anything I've said here, but it sounds cool, so here it is. Then the intellect, that is parent of all by being life and light, engendered a human being equal to itself. And the intellect had a burning desire for it, since it was its own offspring. For the offspring was very beautiful, having its parent's image. For truly even God had a burning desire for its own form, and God handed over its and God handed over to its offspring all its own crafted products.